Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we're continuing Book 2 of the Politics, which focuses on the different accounts of the city or the regime that is best finally administered. And the first few sections chapters here were on Plato, right? Plato's two accounts, first in the Law Republic, and then his laws. About in other words, as I said, that the account in two seemed like he's going to focus on actual regimes, but then what happens is that he talks about first cities and speech, or the ideas about the people who talk about the city in this kind of theoretical sense. And he's given two accounts so far, and that is of Plato's Republic, chapters. It begins right away in chapter one of that, ends up with chapter five being the finishing of it, with his criticisms of Aristotle's account. I mean, Aristotle's criticisms of Plato's or Socrates' Bibesity, and then he gives the account of the in chapter six, last chapter we looked at the laws, and now we're going to turn to someone else. He goes now. There are chapter 7. Okay, so let's start it out. Chapter 7. There are certain other regimes as well. Some of private individuals, other philosophers and political rulers, but all of them are closer than either of those just discussed to establish regimes under which men are now governed. In other words, they're closer to either of those two that we've discussed so far, the city and the republic, or the city of the in the laws, then which are either to closer than either to those just discussed to establish regimes in which men are governed. Now, so we haven't really talked about, anyone hasn't talked about actual regimes in the sense yet, he said. For no one else has shown originality regarding community of women and children, or regarding regarding common nesses for women. They begin rather from the necessary things, right? No one has gone did with these questions of, women and children in common or common messes for women. They deal with necessary things. For some of them hold that a fine arrangement concerning property is the greatest thing. It is about this, they assert, is that all factional conflict arise. In other words, they argue that it's about property difference. In other words, all the people said the real big thing that conflict gets is property. Not arranged. The property is not arranged or beautifully a close, a good arrangement or a beautiful arrangement of concerning this close, fine arrangement of property. This is the most important thing, the greatest thing in that sense. That this is they assert that inequality because of property or not. In other words, problems of the inequality of property leads to the greatest conflict, the stasis that divides the cities within the cities. The first to introduce this was Phallius of Caledon. Now, again, nothing else is really known of Phaedrus Schrumpf, the German classicist who does like a multi-volume edition of this. Really doesn't offer much on this. Again, this is not really much is known about. If it wasn't for Plato, except if it wasn't for Aristotle mentioned here, probably his account would have been forgotten. But he says that it's Phallius of Chaldeon, Phallius of Chaldeon, who asserts that that the property of citizens should be equal. In other words, he's the first communist in a sense. He's the first communist. Okay, even before Plato. Okay, he supposed that this would not be difficult to do in cities just being settled. In those already settled, he supposed it would be troublesome. But that a leveling could be most quickly brought about by having the wealthy give dowries but not receive them, and the poor receive them but not give them. Okay, so therefore he says that this could be achieved at one level, that you can make everyone equal when you create a city, but if you don't, if the city's already the city's already been created, it's more difficult. And the way you could do this about dowries, giving the dowries for marriage, that the many give dowries for marriage, the wealthy give dowry from, in other words, but not, in other words, the wealthy give them but not receive them, and the poor receive them but not give them, right? Plato, when writing the laws, supposed increase in property should be allowed up to a certain point, no citizens being permitted to possess a property more than 5 times the size of the smallest ones, as was said earlier. Right? This is again was addressed in last chapter, in paragraph. Was it? As you said, it was paragraph in 2.2 lines. Um, Paragraphs 8 and 9, 8 through 9, both 8 and 9, right? Um, but those who legislate in this fashion should not overlook what they overlook now, that the arrangement concerning the extent of property should properly include an arrangement concerning the number of children as well. In other words, it's not just only about the size of the property and the wealth, but also the number of children to be done. In other words, they have to. In other words, the amounts of property. If in other words, if you limit the amount of property, but the children grow up, then the division of property and things like that will create unwealth. So therefore, there's a connection between the number of children and the size of property. Okay. Um, in other words, should not be over. But those who legislate in this fashion should not overlook what they overlook now. That what they overlook now is the arrangement concerning the extent of property should should properly include the arrangement concerning the number of children as well. So in other words, if you're going to deal with this, you have to deal with the number of children. Okay, and if the number of children outstrip the size of property, the law will surely be abrogated. And the abrogation aside, it is a bad thing to have many of the wealthy become poor, for such people are apt to become subversives. In other words, now this is a very good point here. That the danger here is twofold. One is that first of all, that if you have too many people, too many children, right? In other words, he says that if the number of children outstrip the size of the property, then the law, this whole idea will be aggravated. It will be ignored. But the other problem here is this: that it's a bad thing that the people who are used to being wealthy, who had property, become poor, because these people will become subversive. They will they become hostile to the regime. Okay? Actually, this is a very important lesson for those idiots like Mr. Schwab and these today's people who talk about, oh, it's not going to, this all this nonsense about Great Reset, about, oh yeah, you'll be own nothing and be happy. Bullshit. You'll have what do you think the great? I mean, a lot of the political resentment today among the populace in the world, it's that people who saw their parents have things that they them now cannot have. Okay, lifestyles and ability that their parents and grandparents were able to have, and that they are now excluded from in that sense. And this is creating. They see and they want to overthrow that regime. So it becomes a revolutionary. It becomes a destructive force. That's what they become subversives. Thus, the leveling of property does indeed have a certain power to the effect the political community. In other words, he's saying that there's a little bit of truth to this. In other words, leveling property, keeping property at a certain level, that there's a certain level of equality. There is a kind of stability here. Okay, right? He's not denying that leveling property does indeed have a certain power to affect the political community, the city, right? This was continued over here. Sorry, move the picture. Plainly recognized by some by some in former times, such as the legislation of Solon, and others have a law which forbids the acquisition of land in whatever amount one wishes. In other words, now the Solon's account was 51. Solon was established legislation was the abolish of debts of the poor and established a moderate democracy. Now this is again, you'll say at the end of the last chapter. Solon's legislation was abolishing debt, allowing the people who had too much debt to get it free. Now, again, this echoes what is talked about in the Old Testament, in the I think it's Leviticus, or maybe I'm wrong. It's in the Leviticus and the account of the Jubilee, which was where people who, after a certain amount of time, the debts you're owed are forgiven. People forgive the debts. And therefore, this is the concept here that people who are bonded over to service for their debts at a certain number of years, after a certain time, a certain cycle of years, they're to be forgiven. Okay, this is like that's the account of in the Old Testament of such a kind of Solonian poverty. Solon argued that too much inequality and too much people who are constantly in poverty, this is not good, and therefore this is why Solon recognizes that. This is the argument is that Phallius' position is not unreasonable, and that legislatures like Solon took into account, or others who have forbidden that the acquisition of land can be whatever it wants. There's limits to what you could transfer or you could acquire. Okay, for the sake of what the benefit of the whole, the stability of the regime. Similarly, a law forbids the sale of property, for example, among the Lucretians, where there is a law against sale unless one can show he has suffered a manifest misfortune. And some attempt to preserve original allotments in colonies. In other words, some regimes will keep the law restricting trade and commerce of property, exchange of property in a certain way, to try to moderate this. And this is very common. In other words, they would argue that the idea that you can just do whatever you want with property, this is a little too dangerous. This is a little too dangerous because what it does is it creates radical instability. Now, some people out there, libertarians, will say, but creative destruction. Well, creative destruction may work well in the aggregate, but enough people will be harmed by it that, how can I say this? People who have nothing to lose are the most dangerous. So therefore, the people who will lose everything are going to be a very dangerous thing for political stability. You need to deal with them if you want a stable regime. If you want, but that means you're going to take away from the rich. Okay, nonsense. Uh, the capitalist system requires laws, requires protection. It requires a political order. Otherwise, it will collapse into chaos, and cheating and breaking of agreements. So destroy the possibility of commerce. So no, I mean commerce. In other words, the existing of commerce requires a community, and that the community requires laws and rules. Therefore, laws come before commerce. The nomos, culture, and habits come before commerce. I know they're going to be libertarians. Oh no! Acquisition comes first. No, human interaction comes first, and trade is something humans do in order to live better, not it's in other words you don't the basics can be done without commerce, without trade. In other words, we engage in trade to deal with what we ourselves cannot accomplish or deliver or produce. It is because we lack something that we need it, and that need can be essential, or it also could be in order to live better, to live well. Okay, so therefore, yes, it is not something that we should say no trade, but rather we should understand what the purpose of trade is. It is to live and live well, not just to acquire, the desire to acquire endlessly. So he talked about that, and he says that it was it was the aberration, abrog, aberration, abrogation. I mean, it was the abrogation means that the breaking of it, the breaching of it, right? Yeah, aggravation of this sort of law at Luksha, that led to their regime becoming overly popular. In again, if you, in other words, the original allotments of land were decided not to be sold, but because things were broken up and sold, the regime became more and more popular, right? Of the people, the many, right? For the result was the offices were no longer filled from the designated assessments. This is 52. Now he says, what eventually happened was that permitting of divisions of the original allotments created a shortage of individuals with the required property qualification for the office. And the qualification was then reduced to allow poor men to serve. This is again, he talks about this again in book 6, chapter 4. And I think also that could be section 10 of line 4, okay? Paragraph. Yet it is possible to have equality of property, but for the amount to be either too great, so that luxury results, or too little, so that they live in penury. I mean, like misery, penury to poverty, absolutely, starting to this. So therefore, you can have, in other words, that equality of property can be, it can be not only just enough, it can also be too much, excessive luxury, results, or too little, right? It is clear then that it is not enough for the legislature to make property equal. He must also he must also aim at a mean. In other words, a mean between excess and too little. In other words, not moderation. It is kind of moderation, but in other words, it's and again, property is about the sustenance and the ways that you can sustain to live your life. These are the ways and means. The Greek word is prior. The means of existence is prior, and that the wealthy have lots of them, and the poor, a few are without. Right? A prior is the poor, and the u prior are the wealthy. Right? And that therefore he's saying that the mean, the ones that is enough. He has enough. They have enough to survive and live well, to live and to live well. Not excessive, but not impunity either. So the goal is not to, therefore, it's not just about this, it's about aiming, it's not about avoiding inequality, but rather avoiding excesses of things, right? That there's a mean of things. Yet, even if they were to arrange a moderate level of property for all, it would not help. For one ought to level desire sooner than property. So therefore, there's a problem, right? He says, okay, but even if you're going to level property, it's not going to help. And this is the famous story about. He says that one ought to level desire sooner than property, but this is impossible. For there's not adequately for those not. It is impossible for those not adequately educated by the laws. In other words, he's saying that there should be what? That, in other words, the laws need to educate people a certain way. But the problem is that not everyone will be properly educated by the laws. In other words, they will not necessarily follow or think that the laws are worthwhile. They may disagree with the laws, and therefore their character is not shaped properly by the laws. In other words, this is a question of education in that sense, or their souls, moderation. In other words, their desires are, they want things that they should not have. In other words, that their desires have not been, their habits and their character have not been such shaped by the regime or educated by the regime, such that their desires are they desire things that are not healthy. In other words, even if you have the moderate level of property, this is not, won't do enough, because you need to level desires. So make sure that people's desires. And he's saying that this is the problem of human wanting, human desires, and that is a aspect of education. Now he says Phaleas would probably object that this is what he himself is saying, For he supposes that cities must have equality in two things: property and education. Okay, so he's saying that. Now, what I just criticized about equality, he's saying that Philius himself would would say that this is no, it's not fair to say criticize him with this argument, because he's saying that needs to be two things. There needs to be not only equality of property, but there's also needs to be or avoidance of radical inequality of property and equality in education. But one ought to say, what the education is to be. So in other words, he says equality. But what educated? What is the education? What specific education? Having it one and the same is no help, for it is possible for it to be one and the same, and yet such sorry, hold on over here. Yet one and the same, um, and yet of such a sort that they intentionally choose to aggrandize themselves with respect to material goods or honor, or to both. In other words, to aggrandize yourself, endless. Doesn't only, but I mean, they choose to aggrandize themselves, make, in other words, give them more, to aggrandize them, give myself more. And he says what? Well, respect to material goods. That's one thing, you can aggrandize yourself, but also honor. In other words, it's not only just goods, wealth that we want, it can also be honor, and then both, right? And that human beings are not only utility seekers, but utility is such a broad concept that honor is a form of utility, right? Status is a form of utility. Thurston Veblen, an American economist, American sociologist, you look at him, used to argue against the classic, his teacher Sumter. Sumter always argued about utility maximizing, or that the wealth seeking, or benefit seeking, or the man was rational in terms of they would seek their improvement and their benefit, right? Utility maximizing. And he would object to that, saying, "Oh no, people are not really economically rational; they are status seekers, right?" That's the whole argument. We like conspicuous consumption, the idea that Veblen talks about, is we consume things to show off our status, to pretend we're better than we are, right? Keeping up with the Joneses and things like that. We want to, well, isn't that kind of an aggrandizement of honor or status, that we want more than we have, or more than we should have, in that sense? And therefore, this is what he says here, right? And he goes, continue in chapter. Further, factional conflict stasis occurs not only because of inequality of property, but also because of inequality of honors. Again, he will talk about this more in book 5, in the first couple of chapters 3 and 4. No, 2 and 3 most likely, but chapter, a little bit at the end of chapter 2 and chapter 3. Of book 5 about revolution or political change, right? That's where he talks about stasis, or the factional conflict, and the way factional conflict creates regime change. He says that, in other words, factional conflict occurs not only because of inequality, but also inequality of honors, though in an opposite way in each case. For many engage in factional conflict because possessions are unequal, but the refined do so because honors are unequal, or maybe even virtue. There's the difference between the good and the bad, right? Hence the verse, in single honor, whether vile or worthy. Now this is 53. This is Homer's Iliad, right? The application. In other words, hence the verse, in single honor, whether vile or worthy. We want more honor, the aggrandizement. In other words, they're different, but they can still produce conflict. Nor do human beings commit injustice only on account of necessary things. In other words, they don't only commit injustice. They commit injustice. In other words, this is the idea. Sometimes people who want good ends up doing evil, because they want virtue, they want justice, but they end up doing great evil and harm. They do evil not only because in other words, human beings do not commit injustice only on account of necessary things, for which Phaleus considers equality primarily a remedy. In other words, so that no one will steal through being cold or hungry. In other words, he argues that that if people want cold and hungry, they won't steal. And equality of property will be a remedy to prevent people from being cold and hungry, right? He says that they don't that in other words, but they also now he can Aristotle now can they also do it for enjoyment and the satisfaction of desire. In other words, it's not only because they don't have it, but maybe they want enjoyment. They do it for enjoyment. They don't need to steal something, but this is we notice this from shoplifting studies. People who study shoplifting and the way shoplifting often done. And sometimes it's people who are not poor who are engaging in shoplifting because it's the thrill of doing it. A lot of children, teenagers engage in shoplifting not because they're poor. Is well, two things. They want something. They don't have they're not poor. They can afford it. Maybe they could afford it. They might not have the immediate means to. They might not have the immediate means to able to prevent that. You have to kill some things. Sorry, I apologize. That was just annoying. Um, they may not have the immediate means to deal with that issue, but it's like okay, to buy it, get it. The parents might say no, you can't. I can't. I don't have the money. I'm not prevented from it, but I want it now. I want a toy now. I want it now. I'll just take it now. So therefore, there is my unconstrained desire, my inability to constrain my desire. It's not like I'm poor. It's that I just want this now, and I can't wait when I have my allowance or the means to get it myself. Um, I have the possibility of getting this. It's not impossible for me to get this, but I want it now, right? And also, they could do it from this risk, doing risk, right? So people not only commit justice because they're hungry and cold, they also do it because of what he says, enjoyment and the satisfaction of desire, the satisfaction of desire. For if they had a desire beyond necessary things, they would commit injustice in order to cure it or to satisfy it. And not only for this reason, because they don't have it, right? They might desire they might desire merely the enjoyment that comes with pleasures unaccompanied by pain. Now, 54, right? This is reading e pormium with the manuscript rather than bracketing the phrase. In other words, this is, I think he's right here. In other words, they desire the mere enjoyment that comes with pleasures unaccompanied by pain, that from labor and things like that. I get to do this without, What remedy is there then for these three things? What remedy is there then for these three things? In other words, for the one, a minimum property and work. For the other, moderation. And for the third, if certain people should want enjoyment through themselves alone, they should not seek a remedy except in connection with philosophy. Or for the other pleasures require human beings. Other pleasures require human beings. The philosophy, in other words, this is interesting. He says, what about this pleasures unaccompanied by pain, right? They desire this. Right? They desire, in other words, the first one you can do it, okay, we should have what? The first, there was enjoying, in other words, of the three things that this problem towards he listed up here, a minimum of property and work, labor. Everyone has some work to do. This is that famous line from Luther, idle hands, the devil's workshop. So everyone has something to do. Keep everyone busy to some degree. Get something to do that they're doing. They have means to be able to feed themselves. In other words, then no one is without means to survive. Work, some kind of work, some kind of labor that they're able to do. And there's some minimum property. That's something they have assets that they can and on the other, moderation. In other words, educate them to moderate their souls, teach them to moderate their desires. And then last, those who want to, desire enjoyment that comes with pains without pleasures. He says philosophy. For the others, pleasures require human beings. All the other pleasures require the human beings. The greatest injustices are committed out of excess. then, not because of necessary things. No one becomes a tyrant in order to get out of the cold. Hence the honors. Hence the honors too are great if one kills a tyrant rather than a thief. Right? He says that you get more honor killing a tyrant than a thief. It's because why? Because no one becomes a tyrant simply because they're cold. They become a tyrant because they want power, they want domination, right? Um, so it is only with a view to minor injustices that the approach of Felius' regime is of assistance. Further, most of okay, let me get some more water. My throat is drying up. Most of what Felius wants to institute is designed to enable them to engage in politics beautifully, to finely, beautifully, nobly, to engage in politics beautifully amongst themselves. But they should do so also with a view to their neighbors and their foreigners. Therefore, it is necessary that the regime be organized with a view to military strength. And he said nothing about this. In other words, how do you arrange your army strength? It's in other words, a regime is not only done with internally by itself, it's in relationship to others. And that's interesting. He's saying that to understand a regime, you must understand not only the people and the place, but your neighbors. And if you fail to take those three things into account, the regime is not going to work. And therefore, this is why he says that. Therefore, uh, 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 um, in other words, uh, 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 is what view their neighbors and all foreigners, right? The foreigners to this. In other words, how are they foreign? Are they surrounded by good people, bad people? Is it threatening or not threatening? Therefore, it is necessary that the regime be organized with a view of military strength. And again, he said, again, repeating myself, he said nothing. Failure said nothing but this. This is the thing with all the lecturers. They want to avoid the military, right? Oh, no, 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 arms. Oh, God, no, no, no. We live in a world that's perfectly happy. Everyone is peaceful. Everyone just sprays roses under flowers around their necks and kumbaya. No, no, no. There's going to be bad people around. There's going to be other nations that are led by bad people. You have to deal with them. You have to deal with them. You have to have the means not only to also you have to deal with internally the bad people among yourself, and then you have to have enough arms, be armed so that the outside people outside who threaten you can be dealt with, and your safety and your security can be maintained. And similarly concerning property, it should be adequate not only for political uses but also for foreign danger. In other words, again, this is my thing about my libertarian friends. Oh, we should have free trade, and of course, we should not, American manufacturing. Oh, it's too expensive. You can go hire these cheap Asian workers, and why not make goods cheaper over there? And okay, but we have to build warships, but we can't build them because we don't have factories anymore, because we shipped all our factories to China and India. But but China and India is not controlled by our government. So when they can say, "Oh no, no, you can't build ships. We're not going to build your ships. No, 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 no. So you can have no navy. No navy for you. No navy for you. Like no soup for you, right?" Uh, uh, you get some Indian or Chinese guy saying to you, "No, no, 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 we're not going to build you a ship. No, no ship for you." Fuck that shit. If we need the ships to protect ourselves and build things, we have to build them. Therefore, we have the instruction. Right now, the Americans cannot even fix a lot of their ships because they have in the 890s and the early thousands. We sent a significant portion of our shipbuilding capacity to the third world. That's stupid. That's and free market thinking did that. Aristotle would say, no, the economy, because you make more money. Everyone makes more money. We're much better off, cheaper goods. Everything's more effective. But now, wait a minute. Are you secure? Now, those countries get to put a veto on your production of your equipment. Now you're at their mercy. Duh. And that's the point. Aristotle would like to criticize that. And he says that it's not only about this, it's about we have to take the concern of property is your, in other words, to not address the political foreign situation you are, the situation of how are you surrounded in the world? And what do you need to keep your citizens safe and secure, and also that you're not going to be intimidated or controlled by those people, by those countries and those places. In other words, you need enough might and ability to do that. So what do you need? In other words, your property must be connected, your wealth must be connected enough that you will put yourself in a situation that, this is what he says, not only for you, in other words, it's similar concerning property, that it should be adequate not only for political uses at home, right, but for also foreign dangers. Hence the extent of it should neither be so much that those near at hand and stronger will desire it, and and those having it will be unable to ward off their attackers. In other words, it should be neither be so much that those near at hand and stronger will desire it, right, taking it from you, and those having it will be unable to ward off the attackers, nor so little that they will be unable to sustain a war even against those who are equal and similar. This paragraph is the point here. This is the kind of Aristotle's. This is kind of like what a realist industrial policy needs to be. Industrial policy needs to be tied to national security interests. In other words, free trade is wonderful if they weren't bad people in the world. That we took China. Well, China in the 1980s was a useful weapon for us against the Russians. So therefore, by helping China, by doing trade with China, this allowed us to defeat the Soviet Union. That wasn't a principled choice. That was a tactical choice. The Chinese regime is still a bad regime. But then all of a sudden, oh yeah, free trade. Oh no, 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 no. See, since the principle of free trade allowed these other countries to become modernized, should be a universal. No, but it didn't. This is an example that after 20 years of that kind of, after all through the 80s and 90s, after Tiananmen Square in 88, 89, and then 20, 30 years after not accomplishing anything and then becoming increasingly centralized and oppressive and increasingly causing trouble against our neighbors. You doing what is that Einstein doing the same thing and expecting different results? It's the definition of insanity. Well, the free trade is an insane policy then in that situation, in that foreign policy concern. Okay, trade cannot be a property and wealth, and this question of property cannot be divorced from the regime question. And the regime question is not only about your people and where you are, but also who are you with, your neighbors, and the world you're in. So therefore, the question of policy needs to take the focus of the regime, but also your neighbors. What are you doing? What is the safety for those? In other words, you need to be able to ward off attack. You must have not only wealth but the strength to protect it, and so that if you don't have the means and strength to protect your wealth, those who are near you and want it will take it, stronger than you to take it, and that you should be strong enough that you're able to. In other words, you should be able to sustain a war, even against those who are equals and similar. Although he has not discussed this, then one should not overlook the extent of property that is advantageous. Now, again, 55. He goes, or perhaps that some amount of property is advantageous. That's the alternative reading of that passage. In other words, one should extent to look at that some amount of property is advantageous. In other words, it's not. We can read this. He has not addressed this. then one should not overlook that the extent that of property is advantageous, what that is advantageous, or that some extent of property, some amount of property is advantageous. Perhaps the best defining principle is that there should be just so much that those who are stronger will not gain if they go to war because of excess, but will go to war only under such circumstances as they would even if their property were not so great. That's a principle. In other words, the principle should be, in other words, you shouldn't go to war to get more. You should go to, in other words, it should be a principle that will not gain if they go to war because of excess, right? But only go to war under some circumstances that they would, even if their property were not great. In other words, they would go to war regardless of the situation of their property. They shouldn't go to war to make themselves richer, to get more. You should go to war only, he says here, that for the same reason you go to war if property was not concerned. It shouldn't be about making more. It should be about protecting yourself and to defensive or to protect someone else. Okay, right? That's a different. For example, when the Autofredites were about to besiege Ardenus, Euboeus bid him examine how much time would be required to take the place and calculate what the expense for this time would be, as he was willing to abandon Ardicus at once for less than this. And by saying this, he caused the Autophradites to have second thoughts and give up their siege, right? In other words, again, this is Ardenus, a strongly fortified town on the north coast of North Asia, together with the other territories in the area, formed an independent state or independent, city or independent political entity under Euboeus, originally a wealthy money changer, and his successor Hemides. The incident involving the Persian general Autophrades probably occurred in 350. In other words, he just looked at the question of it. In other words, he said, calculate how much you do it, and that and he was, and as he was willing to abandon this place at once for less than this. In other words, you give me a offer to make a deal, I can take it. For the property of the citizens to be equal, then, is indeed an advantageous with a view to avoiding factional conflict between them, but it is by no means a great one. No, in other words, it's not the greatest problem. By no means a great one. It's interesting. In other words, the factional conflict. Yes, it's property to avoid factional conflict. Yes, it is an advantage to do this, but it's not a great advantage. For the refined, I think 57 is the whole Chernites common after the upper classes. The refined, for the refined may well become disaffected on the grounds that they do not merit equality. For this reason, they are frequently seen to attack the people and engage in factional conflict. In other words, the people who have been good, in other words, the people who are refined, the better ones, the ones who have sense of their virtue, they feel better than the other people. In other words, the refined ones, right? He says, may well become disaffected on the grounds that they don't merit equality. They're not equal. In other words, in other words, I'm better than these people. Why should I be treated the same with these people? In other words, then they would therefore this is what causes them to attack the people and engage in factional conflict. Further, the wickedness of human beings is insatiable, right? In other words, the wickedness the wickedness of man is insatiable. People who are wicked you can't satisfy their wickedness. They want more and more, right? At first, the 2 oboe allowance was adequate, but now that this is something traditional, they always ask for more and go on without doing so without limit. Now, this is 58. The 2 oboe allowance, the diabolical, is what you think about, right? The 2 oboe allowance is the diabolical, right? Sounds like, right? Was the subsidy paid to Athenian citizens out of the special fund for attendance to the theater, and later to all public festivals. So therefore, the amount of the 2 oboe was given to them. The people come to do all events, right? He says that at first this was enough, but once it became a rule, then they said, "Oh no, no, more. I need more. I need more." So the insatiableness of man, the desire for more, will keep on doing this, right? Um, uh, uh, they always ask for more and go on without limit. Without limit, the nature of desire is without limit. It is with a view to satisfying this that the many live. And so the many, in fact, this is the problem. The many live by what they desire. They live at the level of this, satisfying their desires. The great don't care. May not. Okay, the argument is they desire different things, right? They desire honor. They desire greatness, and therefore they still desire stuff, but what they desire differs, right? And therefore this is the difference of that thing. But in other words, this is the question about this. Um, in other words, it is with a view to satisfying this that the many live, desiring that they want their desire, they want their physical gratification, they want their things, and this is what drives them, the many. To such persons, then, um, requires, now this is 59. This is that weird thing, or in the beginning of such matters is. I read RK with a manuscript instead of doing just conjecture. And in the beginning of such matters, RK. I would have to look at the Greek here, but I would say, oh, sorry. To rule such persons, or in the beginning, RK here is the what is this is the RK, right? The such persons, let's look at that 59. 59 is a beginning point in such matters is, right, to rule such persons, right. This is the problem that this phrase here is like this. Then requires not so much leveling property as providing that those who are respectable by nature will be the sort who have no wish to aggrandize themselves. So the respectable by nature, those who are respectable by nature will be of the sort who will have no wish to aggrandize themselves. While the base, those will not be able to, which will be the case if they are kept inferior, but are done no injustice. In other words, okay, this is what he's saying. He says, okay, the noble ones, the people who have. Let's look at that paragraph because I think that is interesting in that sense. I'll just go to you. He says that the respectable by nature will be the sort who have no wish to aggrandize. So for the ones who are respectable and refined and noble, they should not seek constant aggrandizement. That means getting more, getting more. They should not have a continuous desire to acquire, using the Machiavelli's phrase, right? Whereas the mean, the base, the vulgar, will not be able to acquire. And they won't have the means, the ability to aggrandize themselves. And this is because they were kept inferior, right? But and they won't mind it as long as they're done no injustice. Again, this is 60. Respectable, the ecclesias, and the mean, the prior, are terms referring to social class, right? Again, this is what he says here: the respectable ones and the mean, the many, the vulgar. As long as the vulgar are not done injustice, you can prevent them from being able to act and aggrandize themselves a little bit. Just don't harm them. But again, isn't that Machiavelli's don't touch their women and their property? Most men will forgive you a lot of things, but they won't forgive you if you touch their women or their property. In other words, just leave them alone. Don't. The many just want to be left alone, so leave them alone. Don't do injustice to them. Don't allow them to do what they want, but don't. As long as no justice against them, keep them inferior, keep them controlled, but no injustice. right? But not even what he said about, in other words, but not even what he said about equality of property is right. For he equalizes not only possessions of land, but there may also be wealth in slaves, livestock, and money, and there is a great supply of it in movables, so called. The things are movable. In other words. So not only is it about property, in other words, equality, but what about other things? Either then equality is sought in all these things, or some moderate arrangement, or all are left to be alone. In other words, this is what he's saying here. In other words, it's about property is not only about land, but it's also about movables, which are what slaves, livestock, money, and the things that that's great supply of movables, so-called movables, right? You know, and that therefore, it then either equality is to be sought in all these things, or some moderate arrangement. Some, in other words, there should be some moderate arrangement of these things as well, or they should be left alone, or all ought to be left alone. It is also evident from this legislation that he is instituting a small city. At any rate, all the artisans will be public slaves, and will not contribute to the full complement of the city. So therefore, it's a small city, and that the artisans are not, they're going to be public slaves and not going to be contributing to the full complement of the city. But if there should be public slaves at all, it is those who work at common tasks who should be in this condition, as at Epidemos or Phantos once tried to institute in Athens. In other words, this is the famous, this is a text meaning somewhat uncertain, and he goes, he's going to read it with Weldon. We have no other information about the arrangements of Ephraimos or the scheme of Delphus. In other words, this is the argument here is that these two people tried to do at Athens, which they try to do is that if there's going to be slavery, it shouldn't be about artisans and that, but only the people who just do the meanest work, the meanest tasks of the city needs. The only public slaves should be those who are the very meanest, like the worst jobs that nobody will really want to do, and that you don't have the money to pay the kind of. So in other words, you need to force people to do these things for the public good, and that this is the only kind of concern, and therefore this is the only public. If there's going to be slavery in the public sense, that the public slaves, those private slaves that work for private concerns, then there's public slaves are the slaves who work for the city, that work for the common situation, and that these are and it should not happen in that sense. He says, but then Phallius's thing treats the artisans as slaves. And he says that even other people who thought about this uh, thought not the artisans, but the people that only the most base jobs can be considered this way. Otherwise, it doesn't work or cause problem. Concerning the regime of Phallius, then, whether he happened to have argued beautifully in some respects or not may be discussed from what has been said. In other words, he says, I think some things he's right about, but it's what he's right about is small things. You know, yes, inequality causes poverty is a problem of faction. Yes, that causes factional conflict, but property also produces good things. And then this is the whole point. What he's, in other words, he says that he's right about some things, but he's wrong about others. And this is how he ends the examination of Phallius. So we get another statesman. This is other than Plato. This is Phallius of Calderon becomes his point. And here we end it, chapter 7, and we'll turn to the next one in the next meeting, chapter 8. We talks about Hippodamos, the great city planner. Well, if you have this is your time. If you have any comments or questions about what we covered today, please put it in the below. And if you've liked what you said, like it. If you didn't like it, say no. But please say what's wrong. You can, please, if you have not subscribed already, subscribe. If you like what you do, please get others to subscribe. Encourage people. Hey, we're doing Aristotle's politics. Maybe you want to learn it. Um, um, uh, you can share this on social media and get the attention of this website, this discussion, this reading to others. You can please share it on your social media. That'd be good. Get more attention. You can follow me on various social media below there. I list it below. If you wish to contribute this, I'm not going to talk about it so many times, but I do this at the end of every video. You can help me through Subscribe Star or Patreon. Patreon. I'm not again. This is the more people help, the more I can do more for them. In that sense, I only have like one person to my knowledge so far. He doesn't ask much, so it's not much money. I'm not going to say this. Um, it's useful for that thing. You don't need money. Get all those books in here. Well, I always need more books. Um, um, eh, um, so you can do that. Another way you can help me is if you want to help, you can buy my Lulu book. It's a notebook on Aristotle's politics. It's a workbook. It's like Cliff Notes on politics. It's not to be read in substitute of the politics. It's a kind of study guide as you're going through the politics, with chapter by chapter, book and chapter sections going through it. It's not a commentary. It is basically kind of helping you see through, helping you with the text and understanding aspects of the text. And then it also has a bibliography on the issues of the things of the secondary scholarship. So it's a very good, useful thing for students of this and people studying on the text. And therefore, it'd be worth getting. And if you buy it from Lulu, I get more money. But I understand you probably buy it by Amazon. So it's available on Amazon and most of the online bookstores. You can get a copy. If you buy it through Lulu, I get a bigger share. I get the profit those booksellers will get. But if you buy it, but Lulu usually makes you pay shipping, and most of those other places give you shipping free. So I understand. So please do that. And that's it. I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you next time we have our session. Take care. Bye bye.